Well, dear listeners, I thought that between Christmas and New Year I would lecture you on La Comédie humaine, and I will, in a sense. I will walk you through Monsieur Balzac's rooms where the wallpaper smells of ink, creditors, and boiled coffee. I speak from a kitchen. Rain on the window, kettle breathing, my notes stained with tea. Yet the calendar, that sly clerk, has slipped a second key into my hand, and it opens a door far from Tours and far from the Loire's pale light. Follow it, and you arrive in Cairo, where stone keeps older arguments than any Paris salon, and where the street teaches philosophy with dust on its tongue. Balzac gave France a city of mirrors. He populated it with hungry faces who learn to bow before money while keeping a prayer in their pocket. Cairo answers with another theatre, one whose proscenium stands between minaret shadow and cinema glow, between a family table and the ministry stamp. There Naguib Mahfouz, pronounce him as you would pronounce a careful oath, lets the lane speak, and the lane, being human, lies, confesses, bargains, blesses, betrays. So tonight's hour carries a double passport. We travel from Paris to Al-Jumalia without leaving the chair, and we carry only one contraband: attention. Keep your ears open, the cities will do the rest. In the lecture that follows, titled The Human Comedy of Cairo, I invite you to listen for the same old question dressed in different clothes. How does a person keep a soul while the street keeps score? Fog came down on Tours with the patience of a parish priest, and the river Loire carried its pale plates of light past warehouses and courtyards, where a clerk could learn the weight of paper, long before he learned the weight of a sentence. In that town, on May 20th, 1799, a child arrived into a household that had already made a religion of assent. A father born Bernard Francois Balzac, who had walked from artisan origins toward office and respectability, and who had filed away his old name as though it smelled of the tannery. Please allow a short digression in this place. Balzac's father arrived in Paris in 1760 as Bernard Francois Balzac, carrying the ambition of a man who wanted the door to open when he knocked. By 1776, when he had risen far enough to serve as secretary to the King's Council, he had already begun presenting himself under the more genteel Balzac form of the name. The motive belonged to that hard French arithmetic where a syllable can function as a ladder. Balzac tasted of workshop and village soil. Balzac sounded as if it had learned to bow in an antechamber. He pursued social ascent, and a more noble-sounding surname helped him pass among officials and aspirants who treated lineage as currency. And a mother, Anne-Charlotte Laure Salambier, whose Parisian merchant blood supplied money and an air of entitlement that sat oddly beside provincial damp stone. The marriage itself carried a dissonant arithmetic, youth beside age, capital beside ambition, and the son Honoré grew up with that imbalance ringing in his ear like a coin dropped on a church floor. A wet nurse received him in infancy, and the early separation from the parental body, followed by a household manner that kept children at distance, left its own bruise, one that later reappeared as governesses, tyrants, abandoned girls, and the strange hunger for maternal patronage that would stain his love life with gratitude and shame. A boy of 10 found himself at the Oratorian school in Vendôme, where discipline wore the mask of salvation, and where the lack of spending money became a social mark that the rich boys could read faster than Latin. Honoré carried the experience into his fiction as memory transmuted into architecture, corridors that swallow young men, dormitories that train the body into submission, masters who praise piety while measuring futures in grades and obedience. When he later flooded Paris with young provincials, Rastignac, Lucien, countless unnamed aspirants, he drew upon the sensation of being watched while being starved, the sensation that teaches a child the first lesson of modern society. Appearance governs judgment, while inner worth waits outside the door like a beggar. That early lesson mattered for Balzac's latest science of manners, since the discipline of classification begins with humiliation. The humiliated mind studies its enemies with a cold clarity. Paris entered him as a fever once he reached it as young man and would-be writer, and the fever carried an economic scent. Printer's ink, paper dust, candle smoke, the sour breath of creditors waiting on stairwells. A family wished for law and office, since those professions promised stability and a civic place, yet Honoré preferred the garret and the page. The choice looked romantic in retrospect, yet it unfolded as a chain of practical hardships. Hack work under shared pseudonyms, hurried novels written as commodity, and a craving for recognition that never satisfied itself with modest praise. The city's literary market taught him that genius alone rarely paid rent, and he took the lesson with such literalness that he tried to become the market itself, publisher, printer, type founder, so that the apparatus of books would belong to him as property. That ambition carried the stamp of the era. Post-revolutionary France had witnessed a redistribution of power, and the new god of the street wore the face of money, a god whose sacraments arrived as contracts and promissory notes. A small workshop appeared in Paris in the mid-1820s with presses, lead type, workers, and a young supervisor, and the writer who would later dissect capitalism tried to master its tools with his own hands. Balzac acquired hand presses and large quantities of type, hired staff, and placed his name on the business, as though authorship and ownership could fuse into one sovereign identity. He learned, through failure, how machines devour cash, how delays become interest, how a single misjudged order becomes a year of chasing payments. Bankruptcy hovered, rescue arrived by narrow margins. Debts remained like a tattoo on the soul, and by 1828 the burden ran into tens of thousands of francs. The experience formed more than an anecdote. It became an education in the inner mechanics of modern life, where a person's future could be mortgaged, quantified, sold, then resold, until the self resembled a ledger entry. When his novels later filled with usurers, bankers, lawyers, speculators, and ruined fathers, the writer described a world he had already inhaled. Debt, once it enters the bloodstream, reorganizes time. Balzac worked in brutal rhythms, sleeping in chopped fragments, drinking coffee in quantities that became legend, then revising proofs with a ferocity that terrified printers and delighted creditors who sensed a new book as fresh collateral. He wrote an essay on coffee's pleasures and pains that reads like a confession offered to a stimulant, and the myth of 50 cups a day survives, even as sober observers argue over numbers, yet the relevant fact sits less in arithmetic than in temperament. The man treated his body as fuel for production, and he treated production as an ethical duty owed to fame, love, and the debt register. A manuscript in his hands, rarely moved from draft to print in a clean line. He returned to galleys with additions, substitutions, expansions, and rearrangements, as though the printed page remained a battlefield where meaning could win ground at the last moment. Paris, built in layers, found its mirror in his method. His private life joined the same economy of longing and transaction, though the currency shifted from francs to tenderness. Women older than he, women titled, women married, women unreachable, each became, at various times, a gate to society, a maternal refuge, or an erotic gamble. Madame de Berny, often remembered as Delecta, offered him patronage, affection, and a kind of schooling in aristocratic tone, while his later pursuit of the Duchess de Castries and other grand figures revealed a hunger for rank that matched his adoption of the particle d after 1830, a self-ennobling gesture that carried both comedy and desperation. The scandal here lived in the open secret of Parisian life. Everyone knew everyone's desires, yet everyone acted as though a curtain existed. Balzac turned that moral theatre into a subject, then lived it with a mixture of vanity and self-mockery that still stings when one reads his letters beside his fiction. Then came L'étranger, a voice from the eastern edge of Europe, writing anonymously from an estate that belonged to another world of snow, serfdom's shadow, and Polish aristocratic pride. Ewelina Hanska, born Rzewuska, married to Count Wacław-Hanski, began a correspondence that grew into a long attachment sustained by letters, delays, travel, illness, and the tedious legal tangles of inheritance. Widowhood in 1841 made marriage conceivable, yet obstacles persisted, including the estate's status and a daughter's inheritance. The lovers moved in an orbit where property and family duty dictated pace. Balzac travelled repeatedly eastward in pursuit of her, tasting a different Europe, while his health weakened under years of overwork. The marriage finally occurred in March 1850, then the husband died within months in Paris, leaving a romance that reads, in retrospect, like a novel written by fate with a cruel efficiency. Balzac's grand design, the work that later readers call a cathedral of prose, grew out of that personal chaos and out of a historical moment that begged for diagnosis. France after Napoleon lived through Restoration, July monarchy, and the approach of 1848 with its gathering storms, and the social order behaved like a body undergoing forced surgery while awake. An old aristocracy retained titles, salons, and manners, while the bourgeois class expanded its wealth and influence through commerce, finance, and the law. The new hierarchy looked fluid, yet it enforced itself through invisible codes, especially in Paris, where one address could raise a person's value as swiftly as a title once had. Balzac named his project La Comédie humaine, and framed it as a history of manners and social species, borrowing the language of natural science while refusing science's cold comfort. His pages feel clinical in observation, yet they burn with pity, contempt, fascination, and the secret wish that the world might recover a form of honor that money had begun to counterfeit. The publishing story behind that monument carried its own drama, full of contracts, revisions, and the author's obsession with control. Balzac's texts circulated through journals and volumes across years, often appearing in forms that he later rewrote, expanded, and reorganized as the larger architecture clarified in his mind. The Fern edition of La Comédie humaine, issued by Fern with partners Dubuchet, Hetzel, Paulhan, appeared in 16 volumes between June 1842 and August 1846, with an additional volume later, and it mattered since it represented an edition shaped under the author's eye, closer to what contemporaries read than later posthumous arrangements. The effort required a particular kind of stamina. He had to keep writing fresh material to feed the market, while simultaneously revisiting earlier work to align it with the growing system of scenes, cross-references, recurring characters, and social typologies. A man already hunted by debts chose a path that multiplied labor, since unity demanded revision, and revision demanded time that creditors wished to consume. When you place that Paris beside Cairo, the temptation appears to treat the comparison as a pleasant academic mirror game. Cairo refuses that reduction, since it carried an imperial wound and a religious heartbeat that altered the moral chemistry of every street. Naguib Mahfouz entered the world in December 1911 in Old Cairo, in a lower-middle-class Muslim family whose rhythms mixed piety, bureaucracy, and the tight solidarities of neighborhood life. His name itself bore an origin story. His difficult birth involved an obstetrician celebrated enough to lend his name Naguib Pasha Mahfouz, and the child inherited that doctor's name as a sign of gratitude and survival. He grew up as the youngest of 7, with siblings much older, a household arrangement that produced the social feeling of an only child amid adults. His father, Abdelaziz Ibrahim, worked as civil servant with a conservative temperament, and his mother, Fatima, illiterate yet culturally curious, took her son on excursions to museums and monuments, giving him an early sense that the nation possessed both antiquity and a modern civic face. A boy watched the 1919 revolution unfold, and even if childhood memory retains fragments, chants, flags, sudden fear, rumors of soldiers, the experience engraves the idea that politics enters the street as bodily event. Mahfouz's family moved in 1924 from Al-Jamaliya to Al-Abbasiyah, a shift from dense old quarters toward newer suburb, and the move carried symbolic force. Old Cairo's lanes gave way to broader roads and a slightly different social air, and the future novelist learned to feel the city as layered entity, where each district carries its own manners, tempo, and moral expectations. He studied philosophy at the Egyptian University, receiving his degree in 1934, and then entered the civil service, the path that echoed his father's world, while granting the son a vantage point from inside the state's machinery. The bureaucratic desk with its stamps and files offers a peculiar education in modern power. Decrees travel through hands, lives become cases, and language itself becomes instrument of order. Mahfouz's working life moved through several offices and roles, including service at Cairo University, then the Ministry of Islamic Endowments, later Cultural Administration, connected to censorship and cinema, before retirement in 1971. That career shaped his fiction in 2 ways. It trained him in the patient observation of ordinary people as they negotiate rules, and it placed him close to the state's cultural gatekeeping, where permission, prohibition, and the delicate management of public morals form part of daily practice. A transfer in 1945 took him to a library at Al-Ghuri Mausoleum, and he conducted interviews with residents of his childhood neighborhood for a Good Loans project, an archival human act that resembles fieldwork. The writer, seated with locals, listening to stories, absorbing idiom, learned how a city speaks about itself when power listens. Such experiences later fed his portrayal of the lane as microcosm, a recurring spatial unit through which he could study humanity as condensed society. His early writing began with historical novels, projects inspired by a desire to cover Egypt's pharaonic past in a long series, before he turned toward contemporary Cairo and toward the social novel, a shift driven by an inner historical pressure. The modern period demanded narrative witness. He wrote the Cairo trilogy before the 1952 revolution, completed it in that earlier era, then withheld it from publication until 1956-57, a delay that carries interpretive weight. The revolution brought a new regime with new limits and new sensitivities, and silence becomes a strategy when the writer senses that speech carries cost. When the trilogy finally appeared, it emerged as retrospective anatomy of a world that had already slipped into memory, and that temporal gap allowed Mahfouz to write with the double vision of participant and chronicler. Sources across journalism and scholarship affirm that the work was written before 1952 and published later, which makes the trilogy resemble a sealed bottle opened after the shoreline has already shifted. The family behind the trilogy carried elements of his own memory while remaining its own invented organism. The Al-Jawad household stands on Bain al-Qarain, between the two palaces, in Al-Jamaliya, and the street name anchors the narrative in a real coordinate, the choice that serves as pledge. The story belongs to a particular stone and dust. The patriarch, Al-Sayyid Ahmad, rules at home with a pious severity, while he lives a second life of pleasure outside, the double existence made possible by the city's scale and by masculine privilege. The wife Amina embodies an older ideal of domestic virtue and sheltered existence, while the children splinter into divergent responses to modernity, nationalist activism, sensual indulgence, intellectual doubt, ideological zeal. A reader hears in Kamal's philosophy degree and interior struggle and autobiographical echo, and Mahfouz admitted that he gave Kamal features of himself, including philosophical formation, and a mind that perceives contradictions between religious principles and Western scientific discoveries. The point extends beyond self-portrait. The novelist turned his own divided education into a character's wound, allowing private conflict to stand for the nation's wider crisis. Balzac's family world and Mahfouz's family world appear far apart in geography, yet a similar social desire threaded through them, the desire for respectability. Balzac's father climbed through office. Mahfouz's father served as civil servant. Both households treated work as moral posture. Each writer inherited, therefore, a disciplined relation to social standing, and each writer betrayed it in his own way. Balzac by gambling on art and commerce with reckless hunger, Mahfouz by placing the ordinary lane under the intense light of literature, thereby elevating lives that elite culture might prefer to treat as background noise. Their mothers offered another parallel that carries psychological sharpness. Laura Salambier's distance left Balzac thirsty for maternal substitutes among patrons and lovers. Fatima Mahfouz's excursions into cultural sites gave her son an image of Egypt as layered inheritance, antique and modern, sacred and civic. Maternal action and maternal absence alike become formative scripts, and both men wrote in their distinct keys, as sons haunted by the maternal figure's power to grant legitimacy. Scandal hovered around both lives, though it wore different masks in different climates. Balzac's scandals belonged to Parisian society's appetite for gossip. Romantic entanglements, social climbing, the uneasy spectacle of a writer courting titles and duchesses, the constant chase of money, the flamboyant performance of genius as personal brand. His life appeared as a case study in modern celebrity's early form, where private desire turns into public chatter. Mahfouz's scandal arrived in theological and political form, bound to questions of blasphemy, authority, and the permissible limits of allegory. In 1959 he published Children of Gebelawi in serial form in Al-Aram, and the work provoked opposition from religious authorities. Intervention from President Nasser reportedly played a role in allowing the serial to appear, while book publication remained banned in Egypt for decades, with the first full printing occurring in Lebanon in 1967. The scandal here operated as public argument about sacred representation, yet it also functioned as power struggle. Who possesses the right to interpret religion in a modern nation? Serial publication, a practice that shaped both literary cultures, deserves attention, since it shaped form as well as fate. Balzac wrote within a French market that rewarded installments, sensation, and speed, and the 19th century periodical press formed a machine that fed on narrative, turning chapters into monthly or weekly commodities, while inviting writers to adjust course in response to demand and payment. Mahfouz wrote within Arabic newspaper culture, where serialization in venues such as Al-Aram turned novels into public events unfolding over time, shared by readers who discussed characters as neighbors. Serial form invites a particular rhythm. The chapter ends with tension, the reader returns, the city itself seems to await the next installment. That rhythm helped make Cairo's lane feel communal, and it helped make Paris feel like a system whose pieces interlock across volumes. The reader becomes citizen of the fiction through repeated return, and the city becomes a habit. A hard moment for Mahfouz came decades later, when controversy moved from page to knife. On October 14, 1994, as he sat in a car on the way to a regular gathering, He was stabbed in the neck by an extremist connected with Al-Ghama al-Islamiyah, and the act drew on incitement associated with the cleric Omar Abdul Rahman. He survived, yet the injury limited his writing capacity and altered his remaining years. Reports from the period and later retrospectives describe the attack's context within Egypt's violent 1990s, when militants sought symbolic targets, and when the writer's earlier allegory continued to serve as grievance for those who had never read it, yet wished to punish it. A body that had served the page became battlefield, and the event casts a retrospective shadow on his earlier cautious privacy, including his quiet marriage in 1954 to Atiatullah Ibrahim and his habit of shielding domestic life from media curiosity. Balzac's own hard moments unfolded less as assassination and more as slow attrition, yet the effect could resemble a prolonged siege. Creditors haunted him, sleep fragmented, health deteriorated, travel drained him, the long pursuit of Hanska demanded energy while returning uncertain reward. The end arrived in 1850 after marriage and return to Paris, with the body giving way under the accumulated weight of labour and strain. A detail that often appears in cultural memory, his coffee excess, functions as symbol for a wider truth. The man worked as though time could be conquered by force of will, and the modern economy of publishing rewarded that mania until the body refused. His death, arriving soon after the long-awaited marriage, reads like a cruel joke of providence. Yet it also fits the logic of his own fiction, where desire often achieves its object at the precise moment when the object loses power to heal the desirer. The deeper socio-cultural link between these two writers emerges when one watches how each treated the city as moral instrument. Paris in Balzac's hands acts as laboratory where money redefines virtue. Cairo in Mahfouz's hands acts as crucible where tradition, colonial pressure, and modern ideologies reconfigure the family and the self. Balzac witnessed a France where post-revolutionary mobility tempted every ambitious soul, and he watched the bourgeois ethos translate love, friendship, and family into exchange. Mahfouz witnessed an Egypt negotiating British power, nationalist fervour, and the pull of Western cultural forms, while older religious and patriarchal structures fought to preserve their claims. Both cities turned private life into a public matter, in Paris through gossip, credit, and reputation, in Cairo through communal scrutiny, honour codes, and political surveillance. Each novelist turned that pressure into narrative energy, so that the reader feels the city's hand on the character's shoulder. Balzac's own fiction repeatedly returned to family as arena where society's new laws reveal themselves with a particular cruelty. A father's love becomes bank, a daughter's marriage becomes investment, a son's ambition becomes a bet placed on patronage. The tragedy of Pere Goriot, ruined by devotion to daughters hungry for rank, belongs to the same moral universe as Balzac's business failures. Love enters a market, then gets priced, then gets consumed. In that sense, Balzac wrote his own life in coded form, and his coded life returned as social critique. His adoption of an analytical voice, classifying types, dissecting motives, resembles a defensive measure against his own susceptibility to illusions. A man who fell for dreams of profit and noble love learned to protect himself by turning dream into specimen. Mahfouz treated family with comparable seriousness, yet his moral horizon carried different sacred textures. The Al-Jawad house begins as a miniature empire ruled by patriarchal decree, then gradually loosens as children encounter education, politics, erotic desire, and new ideologies. The change unfolds through scenes of meals, prayers, quarrels, visits, street marches, arrests, weddings, funerals, the slow grammar of life. Amina's domestic confinement holds religious and cultural legitimacy, and her yearning for the street carries the ache of a soul sensing the world's breadth. The sons embody divergent responses: Fahmi's nationalist sacrifice, Yassin's indulgence, Kamal's doubt. Grandchildren later embody ideological polarities that grew in Egypt's 20th century. Through those lives, Mahfouz traced how public history enters the living room, and he showed how the nation's future forms inside arguments between father and son, long before it forms in speeches. The publishing environments that shaped each author altered what each could say, and altered how each said it. Balzac wrote amid a French press and publishing market that rewarded sensation, yet permitted sharp social exposure, provided it arrived dressed as fiction. He could portray bankers and politicians with thin disguises, and readers took pleasure in recognition. Mahfouz wrote within a 20th century Egyptian context where censorship and religious authority could constrain explicit critique, while allegory and realism offered different routes around restriction. His later move into more symbolic modes, exemplified by Children of Gebelawi, showed how a writer can shift register when realism alone grows politically perilous. After finishing the trilogy, he paused for years, then returned with works that carried sharper political charge, shaped by disappointment with post-1952 realities. The state's presence, experienced through his civil service roles, gave him intimate knowledge of the gate's hinges. A moral difference also emerges in how each writer handled belief. Balzac, despite fascination with mysticism and Catholic imagery, presented a world where faith often functions as social currency or as consolation for the weak, while the powerful kneel before money with a sincerity that resembles worship. He treated the confessional as theatre at times, and he portrayed priests as players in social games, though he also granted genuine sanctity to certain figures. Mahfouz, shaped by Islamic culture and by philosophical study, placed faith at the center of daily time, calls to prayer, Quranic cadence, ritual, while showing how modern doubt enters through education, colonial encounter, and inner crisis. Kamal's struggle embodies the modern predicament. A mind trained to seek coherence meets a world where coherence fractures. The lane offers communal meaning, then ideology offers a different meaning, then love offers a third, and each meaning claims the heart with persuasive force. The soul, pulled in several directions, becomes its own battleground. Balzac's relationship with science, which he borrowed as metaphor, carried its own irony. He wrote of social species and of classification, yet his method remained deeply literary, saturated with moral judgment and with metaphysical dread. The 19th century's hunger to know society like nature promised certainty, yet Balzac's pages reveal uncertainty at every corner. Chance interrupts plans, passion derails rationality, the city swallows the innocent. In that sense, his science resembles theology wearing a lab coat. Mahfouz, trained in philosophy and living through Egypt's 20th century ideological storms, offered a parallel tension. He used realist observation to present social truth, yet he also sensed that truth slips away when power, belief, and desire collide. The writer who worked inside censorship understood that representation always meets constraint, whether the constraint arrives as editor, cleric, party, or the writer's own fear. When the Swedish Academy honored Mahfouz in 1988, it praised a body of work rich in nuance and alternating between clear-sighted realism and evocative ambiguity, and the Nobel Prize turned a largely local fame into global attention. The event produced its own mixed consequence. Translation surged, curiosity rose, yet the writer's public status also intensified the risk profile, sharpening the symbolic value of his body as target. He lived with that paradox: global acclaim, local controversy, and a private temperament that disliked journalistic intrusion. His quiet marriage and guarded domestic life, including 2 daughters and a preference for ordinary routine on the Nile's west bank, offered a counter gesture to celebrity's hunger. Balzac, by contrast, pursued fame with theatrical energy and found himself trapped by it, since fame raised expectations, while debts demanded constant new output. Both lives illustrate how literary success behaves as double gift. A student reading Balzac and Mahfouz side by side might seek a tidy thesis about urban novels and national transformation. The flesh of the matter resists tidiness. Balzac wrote from within a France rebuilding itself after revolution, where law, property, and class renegotiated their boundaries in the capital's rooms and streets. Mahfouz wrote from within an Egypt negotiating imperial dominance, nationalist awakening, and post-colonial disappointment, where the state's shadow fell across cafes and homes. Their human comedies resemble each other in scope, yet the moral temperatures differ. Paris shines with a cold brilliance that tempts with status. Cairo breathes with communal intimacy that can comfort and suffocate in the same hour. Their protagonists seek freedom, yet each freedom carries a price demanded by the city's prevailing code. A small scene can carry the argument more faithfully than any abstract claim. Imagine Balzac at his desk at night, Paris outside like a beast inhaling, and a messenger's knock arriving with yet another demand for payment. He bends back over proofs, scratches margins with furious additions, and the printer groans at the cost of resetting type, while the author keeps rewriting since he believes perfection might redeem his life. Imagine Mahfouz in a government office, a file open, a stamp hovering, and his mind drifting toward Al-Jamaliya's lanes, toward the call to prayer, toward the boy he had been during 1919, and toward the family he would place on Bain al-Qairain. He returns home, writes in disciplined sessions, then walks into the city, listening, watching, absorbing. Each scene carries an ethic. Witness demands labor, and labor exacts a toll. A confession belongs here, addressed to the young reader who believes that novels rise from pure inspiration. Balzac's monument grew through commerce, debt, revision, and social hunger. Mahfouz's monument grew through bureaucratic routine, strategic silence, delayed publication, and a constant awareness of cultural limits. The writer, in each case, lived inside forces that his fiction later exposed. Literature, in their hands, became an act of survival and an act of accusation at once, since it preserved human life against the state, the market, the cleric, the salon, the creditor, the gossip, and the inner tyrant each person carries. An ending that resolves everything would lie. Balzac's Paris keeps producing new Rastignacs and new Goriots whenever money promises assent. Mahfouz's Cairo keeps producing new Kamals whenever education fractures inherited faith. The city remains a teacher whose lessons carry blood. If a human comedy exists as mode, it exists as refusal of comfort. It offers the reader a map drawn in sweat, showing where families break, where ideals turn into bargains, where love enters history's machinery and emerges altered. The writer stands at the edge of the street, listening, recording, then paying the bill with his body. Balzac died within months of securing the woman he pursued for years. Mahfouz lived long enough to watch a knife punish an allegory written decades earlier. A strange mercy hides inside those facts. Each life reveals the cost of telling truth under pressure, and each oeuvre remains as a city made from sentences, where readers still walk, still smell coffee or dust, still hear the call to prayer or the rattle of a carriage, still recognize themselves with a shiver. Balzac's birth in Tours on May 20th, 1799, along with the parental names and the earlier family name Balzac, appears consistently in biographical reference works and standard chronologies. The father's self-fashioning through name and office belongs to a wider post-revolutionary pattern of social ascent, pursued through administration and propriety. Wet nursing in late 18th century France carried class meaning as well as medical risk. Many bourgeois families sent infants away to rural nurses for months or years, a practice defended as convenience and attacked as moral indifference. When I press that biographical detail into the language of bruise, I treat it as a psychological emblem rather than a diagnostic claim. Early removal from the mother's body can become, in a novelist's later imagination, an obsession with substitutes, patronesses who feel maternal, lovers who pay debts, aristocratic women who offer both caress and social credential. Balzac's fiction thrives on such transfers of need, where affection and advantage mingle until each contaminates the other. Balzac's schooling at the Collège de Vendôme, run by Oratorians, receives frequent mention in biographies and letters, the institution's austere discipline, and the boy's sense of isolation later echo in his depictions of educational and clerical spaces that discipline the body while sorting futures along economic lines. Accounts of Balzac's ventures as printer and type founder vary in accounting detail, yet they converge on a sequence of rapid expansion, miscalculation, and collapsing liquidity, with the major fact remaining constant. By the late 1820s he carried a heavy debt load, often reported at over 60,000 francs, and that burden shaped both his work habits and his obsession with money's moral authority. A Balzac proof can resemble a battlefield map. Printers and publishers complained about his habit of returning galleys thick with insertions that forced expensive resetting, while Balzac insisted on the living sovereignty of the sentence. I treat this as more than temperament. The physical process of 19th century printing, typeset by hand, pages imposed, corrections charged, made revision a direct confrontation with material cost. Each additional phrase meant labor for someone else, and money owed by the author. Balzac's refusal to accept an early final form mirrors his vision of Paris itself, a city under perpetual construction where facades rise and collapse, fortunes swell and deflate, and identities get refashioned with the same violence as streets. His revision practice becomes a civic metaphor, the page behaving like the arrondissement, shaped by pressure and appetite. Madame de Berny, Delecta, functioned as early patroness and intimate confidante. The Duchesse de Castries belongs to Balzac's later pursuit of aristocratic recognition. The adoption of de Balzac after 1830 forms part of his self-mythology, a social gamble in a culture where particles still signalled rank, even as bourgeois money rewrote the old scripts. The Hauska correspondence began with an anonymous admirer styling herself l'étrangère, and it developed into a long attachment shaped by geography, imperial permissions, and inheritance anxieties. Their marriage took place on March 14, 1850 in Berdyshiv, present-day Ukraine, after delays connected with property and political authority. I linger on the eastern edge of Europe, since the relationship carried Balzac into a borderland world that haunted his century. Polish aristocratic identity under imperial rule, estates tied to peasant labour, Catholic and Orthodox atmospheres entangled with bureaucracy. The romance therefore served as private passion and as historical corridor. It let him feel another Europe's temperature, while reminding him that love, in a world of paperwork, often requires permission. Restoration, July monarchy, and the approach of 1848 supply the political weather for Balzac's mature work. A society recalibrating legitimacy, property, and prestige after revolution and empire, with the city as accelerator of both mobility and corrosion. The Fern edition of La Comédie humaine, Fern with Dubuchet Hetzel Paulin, appeared across 1842, 1846 in 16 volumes, with later supplements. It matters as a relatively author-supervised attempt to impose architectural unity on a body of texts that had entered the world through scattered journals and earlier volume publications. Mahfouz was born on December 11, 1911 in Old Cairo to a lower middle-class Muslim family. The first Naguib Mahfouz, in his compound name, honoured the obstetrician who attended his difficult birth. The family's move in 1924 from Al-Maliyah to Al-Abaziyah marks a social and spatial shift that echoes through his later geography of Cairo. I treat the mother's museum visits as a quiet revolution, an illiterate woman transmitting cultural inheritance by walking her son through stone and glass, teaching him that Egypt carried multiple histories at once: pharaonic display, Islamic devotion, modern nationhood. Such maternal pedagogy helps explain why Mahfouz's realism remains thick with time, as though every alley holds an archive. Biographical studies describe Mahfouz's long civil service career and a 1940s period connected with library and archival work in historic Cairo. The Good Loans Project interviews appear in discussions of his ethnographic attentiveness to neighborhood speech, a habit that later fed his recurring Lane microcosm. The Cairo trilogy appeared in Arabic in 1956-57 with multiple accounts indicating composition before the 1952 revolution, and publication delayed into the new regime's early years. That delay matters for tone. The novels read as both lived memory and post-factum diagnosis, where the writer watches a social world recede even while he inventories its furniture. Children of Gebelawi, 1959, intensified the stakes of representation. Serialized in Al-Aram, challenged by religious authorities, book publication barred in Egypt for decades. First full-book book printing in Lebanon in 1967. I treat the controversy as a dispute over interpretive sovereignty. Who holds authority to narrate sacred structures inside a modern polity, since the novel's fate reveals an ecology where literature, religion, and state power negotiate the boundaries of permissible imagination. The attempted assassination of Mahfouz occurred on October 14, 1994, with subsequent reporting linking the act to extremist networks and to incitement associated with Omar Abdul Rahman. Mahfouz survived with lasting impairment. The Nobel Prize for Literature in 1988 brought global recognition and a Swedish Academy citation praising works rich in nuance, a blessing that also amplified attention toward earlier controversies, intensifying his symbolic exposure.